Story: The Weaver of Unseen Threads. In the arid heart of the kingdom of Magadha, where the red earth cracked under a sun that seemed to judge every living thing, there lived a weaver whose hands were never still, yet his loom produced no cloth that a merchant could weigh or sell. This man did not sit in the bustling market of Rajgir, but rather beneath the skeletal branches of a dying acacia tree, watching the wind dance with the dust to the passing villagers. He appeared as a shell of a man, a ghost caught in the machinery of his own silence. But within the vast cavern of his awareness, a complex geometry of cause and effect was being mapped with terrifying precision. He saw the world not as solid objects or distinct events, but as a shimmering net of intentions that stretched back into the forgotten mists of 1,000 previous lives. Every thought he harbored was a thread, every impulse a knot, and the collective weight of these invisible strands formed the heavy cloak he carried upon his weary shoulders. He realized that the landscape of his current misery, the hunger in his belly and the loneliness in his heart, was not a punishment from a distant deity, but the inevitable architecture of his own previous cravings. The mind, he understood, was an artisan that never slept, carving the path of the future with the blunt tools of current desire. As he sat in the deepening twilight, watching the shadows lengthen across the dirt road that led to the monastery where the Buddha was said to be resting, the weaver began to disentangle the knots of his own resentment. He observed how a single moment of anger towards a stray dog would send a ripple of disharmony through the entirety of his internal field, altering the vibration of his very breath. He saw that the law of karma was not a moralistic ledger of rewards and punishments, but a neutral law of gravity for the soul, where every mental movement possessed a weight that pulled the self toward a corresponding destiny. The weaver contemplated the nature of the loom itself, recognizing that the weaver and the woven were one and the same. There was no external force imposing these patterns, only the momentum of habit and the recursive nature of the ego trying to find permanence in a river of change. He felt the immense responsibility of his own consciousness, understanding that to change the cloth of his life, he had to stop the frantic motion of the shuttle within. The silence of the desert night began to mirror the silence he sought to cultivate within his own chest. He stopped reaching for the threads of tomorrow and stopped clinging to the frayed edges of yesterday. In that suspension of movement, the weaver felt the first pulse of a different kind of existence, one that did not rely on the constant fabrication of identity through action. He saw that the Buddha did not teach a way to win at the game of karma, but a way to step off the board entirely. This realization was like a drop of cool water on a parched tongue, a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of his psyche. He understood that every step he took on that dusty road was a choice between continuing the old pattern or allowing the threads to fall limp and lifeless. The weaver closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to witness the slow dissolution of the weaver himself. As the moon rose over the hills of Bihar, casting a silver glow on the cracked earth, the man remained motionless, a silent observer of the vanishing lines of his own fate. The emptiness he felt was not a void of lack, but a spaciousness of infinite potential, where the laws of karma still operated but found no hook upon which to hang their heavy burdens. He was no longer a victim of the loom, but the space in which the weaving occurred, vast, indifferent, and finally at peace. The journey to the enlightened one was no longer a distance to be traveled on feet of clay, but an inward descent into the quietude that precedes all motion. Every breath became a deliberate act of letting go, a softening of the grip on the self that had been white-knuckled for 40 years. The weaver of unseen threads had finally found the thread that led out of the labyrinth of his own making. It was a thread of pure awareness, thin enough to pass through the eye of a needle, yet strong enough to bridge the chasm between the temporal and the eternal. He sat there until the stars began to fade into the gray light of dawn, a man who had become a monument to the power of a single, clear-eyed observation of the mind at work. Story: the stillness of the fallen leaf. Under the ancient banyan tree within the silent perimeter of the Jetavana Grove, where the air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of jasmine, an elderly monk named Ananda sat in a meditation that felt as deep as the roots of the forest itself. He was not the famous cousin of the Buddha, but a simple man who had spent 3 decades trying to understand the gravity of his own thoughts. Before him, the ground was littered with the debris of the seasons, a mosaic of decaying leaves and broken twigs that whispered of the impermanence of all things. As a light breeze stirred the canopy above, a single yellowed leaf detached itself from a high branch and began its slow, erratic journey toward the floor of the forest. Ananda watched its descent with a gaze that did not blink, seeing in that small motion the entire history of the cosmos and the mechanical inevitability of the law of karma. The leaf did not fall in a straight line, for its path was dictated by the unseen currents of the air, the weight of its own moisture, and the specific angle of its severance from the tree. He saw that the momentum of its fall was established long before it touched the ground, just as the trajectory of a human life is set by the subtle intentions of the heart. He contemplated the invisible wind as the collection of past actions, a force that could not be seen but whose influence was undeniable and absolute. Every choice he had ever made, every word spoken in anger, and every act of kindness performed in secret was a gust of wind that would one day determine the path of his own descent. The monk realized that the difficulty of his current life, the stiffness in his joints and the occasional clouds of doubt that obscured his clarity, were merely the final expressions of a sequence initiated in the distant past. Karma was not a judge sitting on a throne, but the inherent physics of the mind, the way a stone must fall when released from the hand. He felt a profound sense of sobriety as he traced the lineage of his own suffering back to the root of craving. The leaf finally came to rest upon a pile of its ancestors. Perfectly still and utterly devoid of further ambition, Ananda understood that the end of karma was not the attainment of a better life, but the arrival at a state of total equilibrium where no new winds were generated by the ego. He watched his own breath, noting how each inhalation was an attempt to cling to existence and each exhalation was a rehearsal for the final departure. He saw that the struggle against one's destiny was the very thing that fueled the cycle of rebirth, creating a friction that generated heat and more movement. To truly transform a difficult destiny, one had to become like the fallen leaf, accepting the ground upon which one landed without preference or complaint. The monk observed the structures of his own personality, seeing them as temporary shelters built from the salvaged timber of previous experiences. He felt the urge to reach out and move the leaf, to change its position in the dirt. But he restrained his hand, recognizing that even that small desire to alter the external world was a seed of future karma. True mastery lay in the radical non-interference with the unfolding of the law. He sat until the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was swallowed by a velvety darkness, yet his internal vision remained sharp. He perceived the interconnectedness of all beings, how the fall of one leaf was tied to the growth of the next tree, and how the karma of one individual rippled through the lives of many others. There was no such thing as a private thought or a consequence-free action. Everything was recorded in the silent memory of the universe, not as words, but as shifts in the energetic fabric of reality. Ananda felt a great compassion for all those who were still fighting the wind, unaware that their very resistance was what gave the wind its power over them. He remained in the grove for many more hours, becoming a part of the stillness he observed. The law of karma was no longer a burden to be feared, but a truth to be inhabited. He saw that by surrendering to the consequences of the past with full awareness, the power of those consequences began to bleed away, leaving behind a purity of spirit that was no longer subject to the pull of the earth. The monk was no longer an old man waiting for death, but a point of light in a vast darkness, observing the slow fading of the momentum that had carried him through 70 years of searching. As the first light of dawn touched the top of the banyan tree, he stood up, his movements fluid and free of the weight he had carried for so long. He walked toward the monastery, each step a silent prayer of gratitude for the leaf that had taught him the secret of the wind. Story: the echo of the iron chamber. High above the river plains of Kosala, where the wind whistled through the jagged teeth of the mountain peaks, a powerful ruler had retreated into a fortress of his own construction, a place where the walls were 5 cubits thick and the doors were forged from the heaviest iron of the northern provinces. He was a man who believed that his destiny could be outmaneuvered by the sheer force of physical isolation, yet within the absolute silence of his inner sanctum, he found that the atmosphere was heavy with a tension that no guard could intercept. This king spent his hours staring into the flickering flames of a single oil lamp, observing how the shadows on the stone walls seemed to coalesce into the shapes of the men he had betrayed and the villages he had allowed to burn during the expansion of his borders. He understood that these were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but the persistent residues of his own mental actions, the inescapable projection of a mind that had never learned the art of stillness. Every violent thought he had once unleashed now returned to him as a subtle vibration in the air, a resonance that made the very stones of his palace seem to hum with a quiet, judgmental fury. He realized that the law of karma was not a ledger kept by a celestial clerk, but the psychological gravity of one's own history, where every cruelty creates a dent in the fabric of the self that eventually traps the creator within its own curvature. As he contemplated the structure of his fear, he saw that it was not the world that was threatening him, but the momentum of his own past intentions seeking completion in the present moment. He began to perceive the mind as a vast, circular hallway where every echo eventually returns to the source of the sound, amplified by the passage of time. The king recognized that his attempts to secure his external life were merely distractions from the internal collapse that was already underway. He saw the Buddha in his mind's eye, sitting beneath a simple tree with no walls to protect him, yet possessing a peace that the king could not buy with all the gold in the Ganges Valley. The difference, he realized, lay in the quality of the seeds planted in the soil of the heart. While the king had planted thorns and expected roses, the enlightened one had simply ceased the act of planting altogether, allowing the earth to return to its natural, unburdened state. This insight felt like a cold blade of logic cutting through the thick veil of his delusions. He understood that to transform his difficult destiny, he had to stop fighting the echoes and instead investigate the silence from which they emerged. He spent the next 3 days and 3 nights without food or sleep, simply witnessing the rise and fall of his own anxiety without trying to push it away. He observed how the mind habitually manufactures enemies to justify its own internal state of war. As he surrendered the need to be the master of his fate, he felt a strange thinning of the walls around his soul. The iron doors of his chamber did not move, yet he felt as though he were standing in the middle of a vast, open field. He saw that karma only has power over the person who believes they are a separate entity struggling against the universe. In the dissolution of that belief, the weight of the past became as light as a handful of autumn leaves scattered by a sudden breeze. He was no longer a king or a prisoner, but a point of pure observation that remained untouched by the stories it witnessed. The difficult destiny he had feared was revealed to be a phantom, a nightmare that only exists as long as the dreamer remains asleep. As the first light of dawn touched the iron hinges of the door, the man who had been a king felt a profound, wordless forgiveness for himself, not because he deserved it, but because the one who had committed the crimes was now as dead as the yesterday that contained him. He understood that the only way to truly escape the past is to realize that the past has no container in the present other than the mind itself. Story: the weight of the unspoken word. Beside the slow-moving waters of the Yamuna River, where the lotus flowers bowed their heads in the midday heat, a young woman named Sumana spent her days carrying a heavy jar of river water back to her village in the hills. To anyone watching, her burden was merely physical. The strain of the clay vessel against her hip and the heat of the sun on her brow. But within the secret architecture of her mind, she carried a weight that was far more debilitating. She was a woman who harbored a secret bitterness, a collection of grievances against a life that had taken her youth and given her only the dust of the road in return. She saw the law of karma as a cruel inheritance, a debt she was forced to pay for a life she could not remember living. Every step she took felt like an act of resistance against a world that was trying to crush her into the earth. One day, she paused beneath the shade of a massive pipal tree, where a wandering monk sat in a posture of such profound stillness that he seemed to be part of the landscape itself. He did not look at her, yet she felt his presence as a cool, steady pressure against the heat of her own agitation. She sat down nearby, her hands trembling as she adjusted the heavy jar, and began to observe the movement of her own thoughts as if they were fish swimming in the murky depths of the river. She realized that her suffering was not caused by the jar, nor by the heat, nor even by the circumstances of her birth, but by the constant internal narrative she constructed around these facts. The karma she was experiencing was the momentum of her own resentment, a self-perpetuating cycle of thought that turned every experience into a confirmation of her own misery. She saw that the mind has the power to transform even the most difficult destiny by simply altering the quality of the attention it pays to the present moment. She observed how her anger towards her neighbors was like a poison she was drinking herself, expecting them to fall ill while she was the one who suffered the internal burn. This realization was like a sudden opening in the clouds, allowing a single beam of light to touch the dark floor of a dense forest. She understood that the law of karma was actually a form of ultimate freedom, for if her past actions had created her current state, then her current actions possessed the power to create a different future. She did not need to wait for a miracle or the intervention of a god. She only needed to stop fueling the fires of her own discontent. She watched a small beetle struggle across the dusty ground, navigating the mountains of pebbles and the valleys of hoofprints, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming kinship with all of existence. Everything was subject to the same laws, and everything was doing its best to find a way through the maze of its own making. As she sat there, the heavy jar beside her seemed to lose its weight. not because it had become lighter, but because the woman carrying it had stopped fighting the fact of its existence. She understood that karma is not what happens to us, but how we relate to what happens to us. The transformation of her destiny began the moment she stopped asking why the road was so long and instead started noticing the texture of the dust beneath her feet. She saw the Buddha's teachings as a map of the mind's hidden traps, showing her how to step over the pits of craving and around the thorns of aversion. The silence of the monk became her own silence, a spaciousness that could contain both joy and sorrow without being defined by either. She realized that the difficult destiny she had once loathed was actually the perfect classroom for the evolution of her consciousness. Without the weight of the jar, she would never have learned the strength of her own spine. Without the heat of the sun, she would never have appreciated the profound grace of the shade. She stood up and lifted the vessel once more. But this time her movements were synchronized with the rhythm of the universe rather than the friction of her own ego. The walk back to the village was no longer a penance, but a moving meditation. Each footfall a conscious choice to leave behind the old person she had been. The water in the jar was still heavy, but the woman carrying it was finally and completely light. She understood that the only way to truly transform the world is to transform the observer of the world. And in that quiet realization, her difficult destiny was dissolved in the clear waters of awareness. Story: The Mirage of the Burning Desert. In the vast and unforgiving expanse of the Thar Desert, where the horizon shimmered with the heat of 1,000 invisible fires, a merchant named Vardhana found himself separated from his caravan, left with nothing but a half-empty wineskin and the heavy weight of his own regret. As the sun climbed to its zenith, the golden dunes began to transform into the landscapes of his childhood in Varanasi, and he saw the faces of those he had outmaneuvered in the spice trade appearing in the swirling dust. He realized with a terrifying clarity that his thirst was not merely for water, but for a relief from the scorching reality of his own past choices. The law of karma was not an external decree, but the internal furnace that turned his memories into haunting hallucinations. Every lie he had told to increase his profit now manifested as a shimmering lake in the distance, a cruel promise of salvation that dissolved into sand as he approached. He understood that his perception of the world was being filtered through the dense sediment of his previous deceptions, creating a reality where truth was as elusive as the cool evening breeze. As he collapsed onto the burning sand, he stopped trying to reach the phantom water and instead began to observe the frantic vibration of his own panic. He saw that the desert was indifferent to his survival, and that the cruelty he perceived in the landscape was actually the externalization of his own internal coldness towards his competitors. The mind, he perceived, was a master weaver of illusions, capable of turning a difficult destiny into an inescapable prison of mirrors. He began to breathe with the rhythm of the rising heat, surrendering the need to control the outcome of his journey. In that total surrender, the mirages began to fade, leaving behind only the stark, honest reality of the dunes. He saw the Buddha in the distance, not as a physical body, but as a quality of stillness that resided within the very center of the storm. He understood that to transform his fate, he had to stop seeking the water of external validation and instead find the wellspring of integrity within his own chest. The difficult destiny was not the desert itself, but the merchant's refusal to walk the path with a clear heart. As the stars began to pierce the velvet canopy of the night, Vardhana felt a strange coolness spreading through his veins, a peace that was independent of his physical thirst. He was no longer a man lost in the sand, but a soul returning to the source of its own being. stripping away the layers of karma until only the core of awareness remained. The long walk back to civilization was no longer a struggle for life, but a pilgrimage through the geography of his own awakening. Story: the uncarved stone of the Ganges. Upon the rugged slopes of Vulture Peak, where the stones were worn smooth by the prayers of 1,000 seekers, a sculptor named Govinda sat before a massive block of granite that had been dragged from the riverbed below. He had been commissioned to carve an image of a great king, but every time he raised his chisel, he felt a profound resistance in the stone that mirrored the conflict in his own soul. He was a man obsessed with the idea of legacy, believing that his actions in this life would be immortalized in the granite he shaped. Yet he felt the crushing weight of his own insignificance in the face of the eternal flow of the Ganges. He observed how the law of karma operated in the very act of carving, where a single misplaced strike could alter the entire future of the sculpture, just as a single moment of mindless anger could redirect the course of a human life. He saw that the difficult destiny he faced, the failure of his previous works to bring him peace, was the direct result of his desire to impose his ego upon the material world. The stone was not his enemy, but a mirror of his own internal rigidity. As he watched the Buddha walking slowly along the ridge above him, Govinda realized that true mastery lay not in the ability to change the stone, but in the ability to remain unchanged by the stone. He understood that karma was the momentum of the chisel, and that the only way to find freedom was to achieve a state of perfect equanimity where the sculptor and the stone were no longer in opposition. He sat in the fading light, watching the river silvering in the valley below, and he felt the boundaries of his own identity beginning to soften and dissolve. He saw that the difficult destiny of the sculptor was to be forever dissatisfied until he realized that there was nothing to carve. The beauty was already present in the uncarved stone, just as the Buddha nature was already present in the heart of every suffering being. He laid down his tools and simply sat with the granite, allowing the silence of the mountain to penetrate the noisy chambers of his mind. He understood that the transformation of destiny occurred when one stopped trying to carve a better version of oneself and instead accepted the raw, unpolished truth of the present moment. The karma that had bound him to his craft was replaced by a sense of infinite spaciousness, where every action was a natural expression of the whole rather than a desperate attempt to secure a fragment of the self. He felt the weight of the years falling away, leaving him as light as the mountain air and as vast as the sky above. The uncarved stone remained a block of granite, yet in the eyes of the sculptor, it had become a monument to the ultimate liberation from the cycle of cause and effect. He saw that the journey of 1,000 lives was merely a preparation for this single moment of total stillness, where the law of karma was finally recognized as the very vehicle of grace that had led him to the peak. As the night wind began to sing through the pines, the sculptor merged with the mountain, a silent witness to the vanishing of all paths and the arrival at the only destination that ever truly existed.